Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to show you how to make this quilt which I made with a disappearing 4-patch block, and I used the Quilt as you go method to join it all together. This method doesn't have any sashing on the front, but it does on the back, and all the quilting was done with a tramline method. So I sewed 1/4 of an inch from the edge of each seam either side of the seam, if that makes any sense, but you'll find out as we go along. So let's get started.
For this project I used 1 yard of the green floral fabric and 1 yard of the pink floral fabric, 2.5 yards of the cream cotton fabric and 4.5 yards of the floral backing fabric. Cut 42 5-inch by 5-inch squares of the pink fabric and 42 5-inch by 5-inch squares of the green fabric. Then cut 84 5-inch by 5-inch squares of the plain cream fabric. To make your 4-patch, place 1 pink, 1 green and 2 cream squares in this order. Take your right hand top square and place it on top of the left hand square with right sides together. Then take the right side bottom square and place it on the left side bottom square, and then we're going to sew down the right side of each of them. You can then either clip or pin in place before sewing. Sew down each side of your squares, taking 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. No need to back tack at the start and finish on this. And if, like me, you have a special 1/4 of an inch foot for your machine, then good idea to use it for this. If you've chain stitched, then snip your 2 pieces apart and cut off any loose threads. Then set your seams by lightly pressing with the seams closed. Then press the seam towards the patterned piece of fabric and press, and then repeat for your other 2 squares, again pressing towards the patterned fabric. Next, pin the 2 joined pieces together, making sure that you have a plain piece of fabric opposite patterned piece of fabric, and make sure that your 2 seams nest together nicely so that you don't have a gap between the joins. Then take over to your sewing machine and sew, taking 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and be very careful as you go over the joins, making sure that they stay in place. I like to remove the pin at the last minute. Then set your seam by lightly pressing. Then open it out where it is, leaving the seam in position. Then finger press the seam before pressing with hot iron. You will need to make 42 of these before we can start making the quilt. Take your first 4-patch and place it on a rotating cutting mat. If you don't have a rotating cutting mat, you can place it at the side of your table so that you can access it from 2 sides, which make it a little bit easier. Make your first cut 1.5 inches to the right of the centre. Make a nice clean cut, then rotate your cutting mat a 1/4 turn. If you don't have a cutting mat, you can just move around to the side of the table so that you can access a little bit better to cut your next cut, which again will be 1.5 inches from the centre. Continue turning and cutting until you have made 4 cuts 1.5 inches from the centre. When you finish cutting, you need to rearrange your pieces by turning around each of the middle sides and the centrepiece, so it looks something like this. And when you've done this, I like to put them all onto a tray, so I keep all the same pieces together until I've got about maybe 10 or 12 disappearing 4-patch squares ready to assemble. Then repeat the same process with all of the other 4 patches that you're going to turn into disappearing 4 patches, and arrange them all on the tray in the order that you would like them to be. And then when you've got enough ready, you'll be ready to assemble them all. This is the order to sew your pieces. Take the top row middle piece and place it on the top row left, and then the middle piece and place it on the middle left, bottom middle piece on the bottom left. Then if you want to, you can pin or clip them together, making sure that you match up your seams and nest any seams together. It's best to chain piece together. So take the first 2 pieces and sew, taking 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. When you're almost at the end, you need to get your next 2 pieces, match up the seams and pin or clip if you want to, entirely up to you, and then carry on sewing. You can just slide them under, no need to lift the presser foot, just put at the end of the foot and it should accept them, and carry on sewing. So keep sewing in this fashion, taking the top 2 pieces, then the middle 2 pieces, and then the bottom 2 pieces, and keep going until you've sewn together all of the first 2 columns, and we'll sew the 3rd column on separately. But let's get all those first 2 columns sewn together. When all of your first and second columns are sewn together, you'll need to add the 3rd column. I'm just showing you here how it works, but we are going to chain piece them again to make life easier. Starting with your top left and top middle, we're going to attach the top right hand piece to it. So line them up, ready for sewing, and then sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then find your middle right piece and match this up, nesting the seams together, and again sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then find your bottom right hand piece, add this, and again sew, taking your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then carry on sewing all of the right hand pieces until your chain is complete. And here are all of the rows sewn together. Now they just need to be separated. So I kind of keep the 3 rows together and work on 3 at a time. And then we're going to set the seams and press the seams. The top row, we're going to have the seams all going to the left. The middle row, the seams will all go to the right. And then the bottom row, they'll go to the left again, so that they can all nest nicely together. Set and press all of your rows, and then when they're all nicely set and pressed, you can join them together. Take the top row and place it over the middle row with right sides together, and the bottom row also over the middle row, and again place it with right sides together. You can either pin or clip your pieces together. I'm using clips. Make sure that you line up your seams and nest your seams together. That's why we ironed one row to one side and the other row to the other side, so they'll fit nice and flush together. Match up those seams and make sure the seams nest together nicely, with one going to the right, one going to the left, and both the centres in line. Next, sew all your rows together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance and removing your clips as you go along. But don't remove your clip till the last minute, because you want to make sure you keep your seams in line. I like to sew all of my top row together by chain piecing. So there's my first 2 rows sewn together. Now I take my next disappearing 4 patch and gently feed that into the machine, and then carry on sewing. So I'll do all of my middle to top rows first, and when I've done all my middle to top rows, then I turn around and do all my middle to bottom rows. Continue until all rows are joined. Next, press the rows. So start by setting the seams. So set the seam by just gently pressing, then open out, leaving the seam in the upward position, finger press a little bit, and then press with a nice hot iron. And then for the bottom seam, we need that to be going upwards as well. So push it upwards and then press. Ideally, you want to have the seams going upwards on one piece, and then the piece that's going to sit next to it, you want to put the seams going downwards. So if you remember to do one set of seams up and the next set of seams down. Continue to press and set your seams in this way until all 42 pieces have been pressed. This is how they should look. You now have 42 disappearing 4 patches. Cut 42 squares of batting 7.5 inches by 7.5 inches, and 42 squares of backing fabric 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches. Next we're going to layer our quilt pieces. So start by laying your backing piece down with the right side facing down. Then place your batting on top, and then on top of your batting you're going to place your disappearing 4 patch with right side facing upwards. Then pin in place. I put about 9 pins in. Then we're going to sew down each side of each column and down each side of each row. At your sewing machine, sew a 1/4 inch to the side of the first column. Then turn around and go back down and sew a 1/4 inch away from the centre line of the next column. and then do the same to the sides. Then sew on the other side of the seam to all the tram lines we have just made. So we're now going to be sewing on the outside, and we're going to sew down each seam, turn around, come back down the other side, again 1/4 inch away from that centre seam. I'm going to keep going until we've got 2 tram lines on each of our squares. And this is how it should look. Now all 42 of your disappearing 4 patches should have their backing and batting in the centre and be all joined together nicely with a little bit of quilting. Now is the time to cut them down to size. So they're all going to be cut down to exactly 8 inches square. So find the centre line and match that up with the 4 on your quilting ruler. Turn it around, find the centre again, find your 4 inches, match them up, and then trim any excess off the side. If you have a rotating cutting mat, turn it 1/4 turn and then do exactly the same. Find your 4 inches on your ruler, match it up with the centre, and then cut off the excess on the side. If you don't have a rotating cutting mat, then you can just turn your 4 patch or disappearing 4 patch as you go along. So trim all 4 sides, and if you go from the centre to the outside measuring 4 inches, you should end up with a square that is 8 inches by 8 inches, and you will need to do exactly the same for all 42 of your squares. For the sashing, you will need to cut 35 8-inch by 2.5 inch pieces and 6 52-inch by 2.5 inch pieces. You will more than likely need to join your 52-inch pieces of sashing. My fabric was only 44 inches wide. Actually, after taking off the selvages, it was less than that. It was probably more like 40 inches wide. So this is how you join your pieces of fabric for the sashing. Take the strip from the right hand side and place it face down at right angles to the piece on the left hand side. Then draw a line from the top left hand side of the top piece down to the bottom right hand side of the bottom piece from corner to corner at a 45-degree angle, and then pin both your pieces of fabric together ready for sewing. Then at your sewing machine, join together by sewing directly on the line that you drew, backtacking at the start and the finish. Then trim and press your seam open. This is the order to arrange your squares in. Now comes the fun part, to join all of your squares together. So take your first 2 squares and match them up. Decide how you want to have your pattern going and match them up very carefully. As you can see here, I'm matching all the seams so that they join together nicely. So I'm putting a pin in on each of the seams so that I know I've got my seams matched up, and then I'm going to put a joining strip also, but I wanted to get all the seams matched up first with pins. Then I take one of my 2.5 inch wide sashing strips, fold it in half lengthways and place it over the pins, and I put a clip at each end. As I'm having 6 squares to each row, I need to join 6 together at this stage. So doing exactly the same process, matching up all the seams, pinning in place, then putting on the sash with clips. I do the same for all 6 of my squares for each row, and I'm doing 7 rows. So I'm going to do this for 7 rows of 6 squares. Then at your sewing machine, sew together. So you're going to be sewing the sashing and the seam at the same time. You will have a gap all the way around your squares without any batting. That's fine, that's for your seam allowance. Continue to sew all of your 6 pieces together for each row. So you want 6 pieces for the top row, and carry on until you've got 7 rows all sewn together like this. Then we're going to sew 1/4 inch to the side of our seam on our sashing. So there's our seam. We're going to leave it all open and then sew 1/4 inch to the side of the seam. This row of stitching will form part of our quilting. You'll perhaps see it better when it's finished and I show you how it looks open. So you need to do this on all of your seams with the sashing. When all of your rows have been connected together and you've got 7 rows of 6, trim off any loose ends and any excess sashing, turn over to the backing side, and then we're going to fold over the sashing so it covers up those nasty seams. You can either press them open or press them to one side, and if you need to, trim them off a little bit. So just check that when you fold over your sashing, it's going to cover all of the raw edges. You can see here our first row of top stitching, and we can either hand stitch the sash down, or if we prefer, we can machine stitch it, and then it will make another row of top stitching on the other side. So you'll end up with 2 rows like a tram line. But it's entirely up to you. Or another option is to hand stitch first and then go over with your machine to get that top stitching on the front. So fold over your sashing and pin it all in place. It does go over quite nicely and fits quite well. If you choose to hand stitch, go ahead and hand stitch with a whip stitch. If you prefer, you can sew this on your sewing machine. It is a little bit more tricky, and you need to make sure that you've pinned your sashing nice and straight so that when you sew close to the edge, you're going to get a nice straight row of stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. So if you're not confident enough to do this, then you might be advised to either tack it first or hand stitch, entirely up to you. Or if you think you'll find it easy, you could pin on the other side, so on the right side of your fabric, so that you're stitching on the right side of the fabric, and then you can see exactly where you're going, and it might work out a little bit better. But this did actually work out fine for me. I sewed about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the sashing, and as you can see here, it's not too bad. Go ahead and sew down all of your sashing on all of your rows until they're all done. When you've finished all the sashing on all of your rows, it's time to join them all together. So start with your first 2 pieces and match up all of the seams. You also need to make sure that all of your quilting lines up. So the tram lines you did for the quilting, they all need to match up as well. So it's a little bit tricky. Take your time with this and make sure you match them all up nicely like that. And then you can either clip or pin in place. I'm clipping here because when I joined all of the rows together, I sewed the pieces of fabric first, and then I attached the sashing as a separate piece because I just thought that would be easier. So I get all of this pinned or clipped in my case together nicely before sewing with my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Then at your sewing machine, sew taking your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, removing your clips as you go along. Then add your sashing, following the same seam line 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Remember to fold your sashing over so it's double, so it's 2.5 inches wide, but you fold it in half, making it 1.25 inches. Then we're going to do exactly the same as we did with the rows. We're going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from our original seam to make that tram line for our quilting on the other side, using a large stitch of about 3 on my machine. It's number 3. I normally sew at 2 to 2.5, and this is done at 3. I forgot to mention this before. When you've added the sashing and your extra tram line to all of your rows, trim off any excess so that you can turn your sashing over nicely without any of the seam showing through. My scissors are not very good here, but I didn't want to use my best scissors to cut through the batting because it can blunt them, but it might have been a better option. Then you can either press your seam open or press it all in one direction, and I'm choosing to press this one open, I believe, but most of them I actually press the seam to go down. Then you can fold over your sashing and pin in place. Fold over the sashing to hide the seams and pin in place near the edge of the sashing, about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, as this is where we're going to stitch. As before, you can either hand stitch or you can sew on your sewing machine. It's entirely up to you. Continue to join all of your pieces together, matching up all of your seams as you go, making sure that you match every seam and all of your quilting so all the lines match up. And you can either add your sashing, as I did before, separately after you've already joined the two pieces together, or like I'm doing here, you can add it along with the seam. By pinning your rows together first and then at your sewing machine, fold your sashing in half down the centre and attach your sashing as you go along. I just find it easier to do this way than to pinning it all together. I found this out as I went along with this process, but it's a lot easier to pin first and then add your sashing at the machine as you go along. Remembering, of course, to fold it in half and taking your 1/4 inch seam allowance. When all your rows are joined together, it should look something a bit like this.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, you might like to watch my other video, A Quilt As You Go. This is made with scraps, and here is the link. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.